Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I am here with another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads. Today, we're going to be talking about Julian by Gore Vidal. I've read one or two others, and he has a whole series of these kind of historical fiction books about a specific period or specific character. One of the other ones, there's one called Creation I know about that is kind of a lot of the material that's in Herodotus's histories, basically the Persian Wars, but also a lot of other kind of stuff happening in the world at that time. And there's, I think, one about Aaron called like Burr for Aaron Burr, who shot Alexander Hamilton, and among other things, obviously. And one about Lincoln, I think, and some others. I don't remember all of them. But anyway, Julian is about the emperor known as Julian the Apostate. And Julian the Apostate was the grandson of Constantine, who famously had his moment of conversion to Christianity, saw the either, depending on the specific story, either had a vision of the cross or the Cairo before a battle to basically control the the Roman Empire. He was sort of, maybe either, depending on your interpretation, either a pretender or the rightful heir to the throne who did not receive it and all of that. And anyway, Julian is known as the apostate because he turned his back on the church, and in his fairly brief time as emperor, basically attempted to halt the process of transformation of the Roman Empire into a definitively Christian state. And there's a lot of that in this book, although a lot of it is later on in the book. Is presented as a memoir written by Julian in kind of two main sections, and then also with some commentary from some other characters. There's a philosopher who lives in Antioch and one who lives in Athens. And the one who lives in Athens, Priscus, and the one who lives in Antioch is Libanus or Libanius. And basically, Priscus, before Julian's death, he was narrating a memoir, dictating a memoir, and Priscus stole the manuscript and then also took Julian's kind of field notes from near the end of his life, the parts that he didn't get a chance to narrate in the memoir. And basically, there's this idea of writing a book about Julian, a history of this figure, from this material, that the reigning emperor Theodosius ends up saying, nope, we're not going to do that. Um, and so that's put a stop to, but the text of the book presents itself as this memoir and these notes with commentary from these other two men, um, both of whom are kind of cranky old guys who don't seem to like each other very much, but talk about how much they like each other, um, and get very kind of self-righteous and hypocritical at times, and sort of a almost comedic effect of these sort of two men in the aftermath of this figure of Julian. Anyway, the life story of Julian is really interesting, from the starting point, because he is, like I said, he's Constantine's grandson. He's the nephew of Constantius, who's the emperor for most of, or the emperor of the East at least, for most of the period covered in the book, um, and who ends up killing off a great many of the potential other heirs to the throne. Essentially, all of the other, mostly men and sometimes women, who might have a chance to destabilize the regime by starting a civil war to put themselves on the throne, until eventually there are almost no potential heirs left except for Julian and Gallus, Julian's older brother. And Constantius does not have an heir. He's unable to sire a child, apparently. And this is seen as a retributive measure, a punishment for the violence that he has done to his family. And so, of course, this becomes a real problem because, an emperor without an heir is also a good way to start a civil war. Um, Julian himself is presented as kind of bookish, and he lives in the shadow of his older brother, who is um, much more militarily capable, who is, kind of training to be a soldier, and is um, not necessarily as bright, but is much more kind of virile and all of that, and who has a real kind of streak of cruelty and all of the worst qualities of the Roman emperors. And Julian is concerned about that quality in his brother and is worried about his own potential ability to fall into those um, traits of uh, torture and violence and all of those sorts of things. Um, and then we get into a lot of his kind of young adult life, basically his desire to be a philosopher, his learning from all these different people, his eventual um, secret conversion to a kind of syncretic idea of paganism. In some ways, it's a specifically one of the things that is sort of talked about is Julian's expression of what this paganism actually is, and this idea that all of these kind of myths and stories are expressions of a singular divine being that is somewhat, in a lot of ways, kind of similar to the one God of the Christians, but has all these different details about him, you might say, or about them, you might say, um, and who therefore kind of expresses a different flavor of understanding of the infinite. And Julian ends up learning from a number of influential people about this, all of these ideas, and that's kind of part of how he creates this vision of what his personal ideal of religious, it kind of belief ought to be like. Um, And of course, while he is doing that, there is real kind of political stuff happening behind the scenes that he's not as aware of until eventually his brother Gallus is killed by Constantius. And after some time, Julian is elevated to the purple, is elevated to the rank of Caesar, which is this after the Diocletian's reforms. There's this idea of having two Augustuses, which are the kind of senior position, and two Caesars, which are the junior position, and the Caesar is expected to become the next Augustus, is the idea, right? Grooming an heir, essentially. And basically, one pair in the East and one pair in the West. In practice, that isn't really happening because there's only one Augustus at this time and eventually one Caesar. Julian is sent to Gaul to deal with the barbarian invasions there, finds out that he has been sent as basically a symbolic gesture and hasn't been given any real power at all, and doesn't know what he's going to do, and figures out how to um, gather himself at least a little bit of power, including eventually an army, and turns out to be really good at winning wars, which of course is good for Julian in some ways and bad for Julian and the whole, stability of the empire in other ways, because there's nothing like a successful military general in Roman times to lend itself to the potential of somebody trying to shoot for all the way to the top of the pyramid of power. Um, anyway, and that's sort of what happens, that Julian is pushed into, presented as himself being pushed into eventual rebellion against Constantius, because Constantius tries to take all of his troops away, and he's made promises to them, and all of this back and forth, and eventually it turns into a sort of I mean, it is essentially civil war that is not actively being fought because the major power players are so far apart. Constantius has been gathering troops to invade Persia. The Sasanian dynasty is in charge in Persia, and so he is trying to fight them. Um, and so he has a lot more troops, but he's also, again, they're very far apart, and so they're not really fighting. And Julian ends up basically, there's a little bit of civil war that happens, and then Constantius dies, and it turns out has nominated Julian to be his heir. And so Julian becomes the sole emperor, and the last kind of third of the book or so is him as emperor, attempting to do all these things that he envisions for reshaping the nature of the empire, eventually invading Persia, and having all of that kind of fall apart at the very end. It's a very kind of, classic tragic collapse, that Julian has this kind of vision of grandeur and this expectation of being able to do all of these great things and conquer all of these different peoples and all this stuff, and in the end is unwilling to simply accept a less definitive victory over the Persians, and ends up deep in enemy territory without any food, and the whole army is basically on the edge of mutiny, and it's, the collapse basically. And then he is killed. He ends up going into battle without his armor, trying to lead from the front, and is badly wounded, and wounded in such a way that he does not die immediately, but that it is clear that there is no coming back from this one, and dies in the field. Anyway, and then there is a little bit more at the end of the sort of commentary from these two men who have been interjecting comments in the middle of the story up until this point, and they talk a little bit about kind of what has happened since Julian's death. But it makes for a really interesting story. I think it's really well told. There's a lot of really great historical detail in here, in a period that is, I think, not necessarily as understudied as it can seem at first, but is definitely not necessarily as, doesn't feel like it has the same kind of immediate attraction and immediate familiarity as, say, like the end of the Roman Republic, right? It seems like when people are interested in Roman history, part of it is that that period is so well documented, both in the actual kind of original sources and in modern sources, that, like, yeah, people talking about like Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus and Augustus and Cicero and Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and all of the characters in all those stories. I mean, some of them you might not know as much about. Marcus Lepidus, right? We don't know. Nobody cares quite as much about him. But anyway, and that this is a period that there is sort of a sense of the grand decline, right? The Edward Gibbon decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Um, but of course, it is a kind of an element of historical contingency to say that the people living through it didn't necessarily think of it as the grand decline. They might have had some sense of the reality of a decline kind of happening, but that they saw it as just like a period that they lived in, rather than a kind of one. spot on the chart that marks these kind of great movements of history, even though at times they do have that sense of being kind of a part of these great moments of history. And that's also part of what Julian is about, which is really, it's interesting. And I liked this one quite a bit. It's not a period that I have a huge amount of background in. And there's an element of, like a lot of historical fiction that has a lot of historical characters, there's elements that can be hard to keep track of and things like that. The kind of, I think this one does a good job of presenting all of the things that you might want to know. There's not really an expectation of a great deal of prior knowledge about this period or about any of the characters. But it is a, you know, a story with a lot of characters involved. So anyway, Julian by Gore Vidal, I enjoyed it quite a bit. It's a lot of fun. It's yeah, it's kind of grand historical fiction about all of these kind of larger than life characters, in particular Julian himself. So anyway, I would say check it out if that sounds interesting. If you're interested in that particular kind of historical period, it's a really good, I think, introduction to a lot of the kind of complex issues that are going on in this era of the later Roman Empire, after Diocletian and after all of these, and after Constantine, obviously, all of the kind of things that are going on, and sort of a sense of how they thought about themselves, right? In kind of interesting ways. So, anyway, that is going to be that for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.